Great. Well, Ollie, welcome to the channel. Thanks for taking the time to talk to me today about 15 years of Beachcomber's Windowsill, Stornoway's, brilliant bucolic debut record. But we were just talking a moment ago, and actually I think it's kind of 20 years since the band formed, if I'm not mistaken. When we talk about those milestones, how does it feel kind of looking back all these years later at the formation of the band and the first record? What emotions go through your head?
Fondness is the word I chiefly associate with Stornoway and the friendships and the journey we've shared. But secondly, technology. I'm a person who's fascinated by technology and how it changes society and music making in particular. And when I reflect on the fact that Stornoway, since its inception, has been governed by email as the way we chiefly communicate, social media as the way we chiefly distribute, and increasingly digital streaming broadcast as the way we get our music heard by new people out there. For me, it's really fascinating and kind of dystopian that, to answer your question of whether it really was 20 years ago that we formed, I could just log into my Gmail right now and check, was that first ever email I got from Brian? It might have been 20 years ago to this week. I think March 20, where are we now? Yeah, 2005 was pretty much that. But I find it concerning as well as entertaining to think that no bands before this generation had quite that level of breadcrumb trail. The Beatles probably had their memories and maybe their letters that they wrote each other or typed each other to decide, when did we actually meet, when did we come up with that idea, when did we decide to hire Brian Epstein. For us, it's all there in black and white, in ones and zeros. And I don't know if anyone else really feels this, but for me, it's like a very clear demonstration of how different music making is in the modern era.
Absolutely. I think it's very interesting what you say about where we are digitally compared to when the band first started. And actually, that's one of the things that the band sing about on that debut record, which I want to get into later when you sing about the song "We Are the Battery Human," which I've heard you talk about as a particularly important song for the band, almost a kind of anthem for the band, if you like. But I just want to go back to those early days. You talked about kind of those emails you have from Brian in the early days, and the origin story of Stornoway is quite interesting. The kind of common story you read about when the band formed is when Brian and John met in Freshers Week at Oxford University as PhD students. And I understand that you auditioned for the band, but you were actually kind of a school leaver at the time. So a very interesting story of how that came about. What were your first impressions of meeting Brian and John? And can you talk a little bit about, was there an age gap between you? How did that feel when you guys first met? Did you feel that between you, or was there an immediate musical chemistry?
I think to answer that, I need to explain a bit about my personal background in the Oxford music scene. I had arrived in Oxford as a 15-year-old from the other side of the world. I'd grown up in South Africa, and the music making I'd done there had been either listening to extremely commercial American music that had made its way through the radio system into South Africa. That's just kind of what we ended up listening to in the cities. Or a totally contrasting learning by ear vocal tradition. And I learned to sing in Zulu. I learned gumboot dancing. I was playing on traditional instruments, but learning them by ear and not by notation. So I had this weird urban-rural imbalance in my musical upbringing. But then I arrived in Oxford, and it's just neither of those things. It's not the commercial urban American pop that you can hear elsewhere in the world. It's got its own indie rock scene, and it's not the learning by ear of ancient African traditions in other languages. It's pretty strictly trad English folk. So I arrived in this new paradigm in Oxford as a kid, ill-equipped to deal with that paradigm. And I spent a couple of years until about 17, basically quite lonely and solitary, and trying to focus on schoolwork. But then I sort of fell in love with guitar music, because there was so much of it in Oxford at that time. You had great indie bands doing incredible things. Radiohead, Foals, Supergrass were all having an impact already in about 2005. Obviously Radiohead for quite a long while before that. So there I am at 17, and I was browsing the music scene forums one day, trying to just hear about interesting music out there, gigs to go and watch. And I stumbled across an ad, I guess you call it a classified or anonymous ad on the forum saying, well, there were a bunch of them, some saying like secondhand bass amp for sale. Another one would say DJ looking for work. These kinds of ads, and they're on a site called dailyinformation.co.uk. But the musicians section on that particular day that I happened to be browsing when I should have been doing my homework had a 10-word ad from some guy in Wolfson College across town who had some demos and said, we're looking for a bass player. And so I just scrolled into that, and I think I was able to download a demo and fell in love with it immediately. It was probably Gondwanaland or The Pupil of Your Eye. Those are the two tracks that were that Brian had demoed, and they showed these two fascinatingly contrasting sounds. Gondwanaland is the B-side to Saw You Blink, which we released 5 years after Meeting, and that is pastoral, haunting, lilting, and ethereal, and that captured something of my, I don't know, romantic side that I must have, because I listened to it like 10 times on loop. And then Pupil of Your Eye was the other side of who I was, and I think I still have this in me. I'm really like, I'm the likeliest to crowd surf in the band, and I love going to a mosh party, and I love listening to loud, fast music from time to time. And People of Your Eye, I don't think we've played it live for about 15 years now, but that's what that captured. It was that side of Stornoway, which is a bit wild. And so it was also the very first time I'd applied to join anyone's band or go to any sort of audition. So what happened next was Brian replied and invited me to head over to Wolfson College at the other side of town, because I was in Cowley, they were in Wolfson. Turned up with my bass, and I was immediately aware of, just because of everyone else in the college, it's a mature students' college. It's for postgrads exclusively. So everyone there is in their 20s or perhaps 30s and older, and there I am at 17. But Brian and John both have this very kind of youthful, wonderful, creative energy about them, and they seemed a bit more, I don't know, young at heart than most of the other people there. And so we got on really well, I'd say, from the first time I stepped into the audition room, and we just very quietly in our way sort of walked through a bunch of songs. I think it was going to be Gondwanaland and Saw You Blink, but already by that time we were looking at songs like Boats and Trains, and almost certainly Hedonism, which to this day we have never released or even recorded properly, but there is a very, very scratchy live performance that's captured on YouTube. Mm-hmm. I was aware of the age gap, and I was aware that I was this fairly confused, lonely teen walking into a situation that had the potential to create something, and it certainly did. It's created my two longest extant friendships, and a story that has ended up being the cornerstone of my identity, not just as a musician, but as a person. I'm in Stornoway till the end, and it's been a real thrill and a roller coaster. And how many decades we've still got left to run. It's been the most fascinating adventure already.
It's always interesting to get into those kind of early days of the band and hear how you guys first gelled and what were those kind of musical influences. So it's really interesting to hear what you said. And I'm really intrigued by the fact you talked about the South African heritage as well, Ollie. And I know you kind of talked about how that's been important to the qualities you brought to the band's sound as well. And obviously you brought in your brother as well, who was brought up in South Africa. What do you think that kind of heritage and upbringing and the kind of sounds that you heard when you were, a youngster or an adolescent in South Africa, what do you think that brought to the band's sound, particularly the rhythm section off the early days and also the first record generally, that kind of the two of you as brothers on bass and drums in the band?
We had been making music together since as far back as I could remember, age 5 and 3, probably, making up nonsense rhymes and clapping sequences and things in South Africa. By the time we got to Oxford, Rob was a star drummer. So his training at school in SA had been very disciplined, lots of jazz and classical and then lots of rock drumming as well. And he was known as not only the best drummer in his school, but pretty much in the city of Johannesburg, obviously in his age group. He was so talented and driven that one day at his school concert in the sort of the musical, the drum teacher who had been meant to be playing all the drum parts, I think the musical was Grease, which has some really challenging and diverse rhythms in there. So the drum, the teacher fell ill, and Rob was called in to do as good a job of the drumming as he could, and he nailed it, note perfect, every one of the performances of the run, to such an extent that they then no longer asked the drum teacher to do it anymore. They said, we should be getting the kids to do this, especially if we got a kid who drums as if he's 20 years older than he is. Rob was just, he had it wasn't just raw talent, he'd also worked really hard at it. So to be able to, after I'd auditioned with Brian and John and then spent a subsequent maybe 3 months with them, visiting Wolfson College or the various rehearsal spaces that we had in Oxford, we decided that we definitely needed a drummer. But with my brother being not only as young as I was, but 2 years younger than me, so an age gap of 11 years between him and Brian, I was very hesitant to even consider that such a junior kid could come in. But I guess I think I still feel that was a fair assumption, even though I subsequently realized that it probably would have been better if we got Rob in earlier. What we instead did was we spent 3 or 4 months auditioning friends, acquaintances, and then total strangers that we met on these online forums, and just never found the kind of soulmate match that we did when we finally got Rob in. And I can't remember what led to it. I think maybe after the fifth audition of Mismatched Drummer, I said to Brian and John, maybe we should just get my brother in sometime, even if it's not an audition, just to jam along, because I know I've been playing him the demos at home and he loves them. So we see what happens. And they sort of went, "What, your brother drums? That's well, we should definitely just get him in. Of course, that's fantastic." So I brought him along, and within one song of playing together, it was very obvious that should be the configuration. Brian, John, Oli, and Rob. Then going back to your question about the rhythm aspect, Rob and I had collaborated as a rhythm section for a long time before he came in for that initial audition. We must have spent 2 years. By the time I met Brian and John, Rob and I had been jamming in the attic for a couple of years, playing me on guitar, him on drums, trying to reenact some of the pop punk that we were so in love with growing up. We would try and play Blink-182, which is incredibly challenging on the drums. And also I was trying to reimagine a bassist and a guitarist both at the same time on a single instrument. And then we were both trying to sing out all the harmonies and things. We had a whole catalogue of music that we would just practice every single afternoon after school. I think that's what helped when he then came into audition. It was like we were auditioning as a pair, because you have to have your bassist and your drummer really locked in, and that's what we were. So where we're at today is having reunited after the 5-year hiatus, 2017 to 2022, but not having Rob in this new incarnation. It's just he's got this new life in America. He's making music out there, and we desperately want him back. But he needs to have his own musical adventure for a while. Is that we've had to reimagine the rhythm. We've sort of maybe uncluttered the rhythmic arrangements a little bit, to the extent that if we go on an unplugged tour and we don't have the drummer, I can pretty much get by doing the tambourine on one foot and a kick drum effect on the other foot, and maybe a shaker on one ankle. So it's been really a new, interesting, challenging era of the band to be reduced to the 3-piece, and we'll see how long that lasts.
That's really interesting, and thanks for taking the time to reflect on that. I actually came up with I found a quote from your bandmate John, actually from a few years ago, Oli, and he said, in the early days, I think Rob and Oli being actual brothers was probably the glue that held the group together, but we didn't really know if we were coming or going. Musically too, they have a psychic connection as the greatest rhythm section. So I think you've been able to kind of very much explain that psychic connection there, and your heritage has such a big part of it. And we'll talk about the specific parts on the album in a moment. Just kind of reflecting on that. How did it feel being in a band with your brother for all those years? Because when we think about brothers in bands, we think about the Gallaghers, I think, as the most foremost example, and obviously they have a lot of fracture between them. Was that an easy fit for you guys, especially being so young when you started Stornoway, or did you have your moments?
I think there are some aspects of being in a band that are made incredibly easy and clarified by having a sibling there. As basic and prosaic as when you turn up to the hotel at the end of your long night on tour and you have to just check in and it's like 1 a.m. and there's that awkward conversation where everyone says who's going to be whose roommate. No, in some bands there's always just the two people who will always room share, and for us it's just obvious the brothers will shack up, and it really helped because we were always there for each other. If you need to borrow a t-shirt because you run out, you know who to ask, and it's always who can share your equipment or your rider, or you're kind of brothers not only in blood but brothers in arms. And there's aspects that are just you have your friend that you'll always be able to rely on. But I think it's really important to acknowledge not just the Gallaghers and bands where there are siblings, but are there other instances where siblings exist in groups and companies? It helps me reflect on how confusing it can be to be in a band, because that's the only example I can think of a company where you get given a ton of money by an investor, effectively your record label, and another ton of money by another investor, that's your publisher, and then given the keys to this kingdom. In our case, 4 kids in their mostly 20s, but Rob was still about 17 when we got signed. And you're given the funding and the free rein, but no textbook to go off and run your company, and you're meant to sort of deal with all the crazy things that can happen there. So money losing tours, of which we had maybe one too many. We generally accounted quite well on our tours, but we just in our first incarnation we weren't trained in how to manage the business, manage the bottom line. Other things like how to brand yourself or how to network, things that business people have to do. But for some reason, bands are treated as unique, magical startup companies that don't need any of that hand-holding. Whereas if you were starting a tech company or a gardening business or whatever it might be, your founders get a lot of coaching and support in whatever ways. A band is a funny one because even though I had my sibling there to support me, I felt as confused as so many others do in starting out in music. And it's one of the most, one of the strangest, most unpredictable industries, I think. Starting a band, you got all these revenue streams from merchandise to publishing and performance, and it's really hard to make it work. So, yeah, in the end, being able to have a sibling there and ask and answer each other's questions about, oh, what are we really doing here business-wise? Are we meant to be doing this or that? Do we agree values-wise on where the company's going? It really does help to have a sibling involved in all those kinds of questions.
It's very interesting. And, you raise a really interesting point, Ollie, which I'd never really considered before. It is like almost a business. You're kind of, like you say, there's a label and publishers investing a lot of faith in for very young men often, or young women, or a mix of the two. And you're kind of sent off and, things go well, hopefully for a long time, but things can easily fail. That's a lot of pressure to have on the shoulders of a very young set of people. So having a kind of backbone of blood, like you say, is must be a very emboldening thing as you do that. And talking about those early days of the band, you kind of form with Brian and John, you get Rob on board, and you start, and it seems that you find success comparatively quickly. You're gigging for a while, but within maybe 5 years or so, you've got a record deal from, you've been signed by 4AD. You're on Jools Holland as the first unsigned band, playing alongside the likes of Jay-Z and Norah Jones. How did it feel kind of going through that kind of whirlwind in those early days?
I'll start with the Jools Holland night. I saw a lot of magical significance in the fact that night took place. The recording of the Jools Holland show took place on my birthday, 21st birthday as well. And that we were there with these bands, these artists, all of whom had been extremely influential on me and Rob, and also Brian and John, but in different ways. So for us, being a sort of MTV generation, the Foo Fighters, who were a very video-centric band, we'd seen them again and again and again, and then to see them in the flesh was exhilarating, but also terrifying. Because it was my birthday, Adam, our trumpet player, took me down we went to see the Foo Fighters, find their dressing room and, go say hi. And Dave Grohl said to me, "Oh man, it's your birthday. Come on in, have a beer. Oh, we're going to have the best time." But because I was so terrified and naive and just out of place, I was like, "Oh, it's cool. I don't want to, interrupt or, I don't cramp your style, but it's okay. I'll just do my, don't worry." And he's like, "Oh, come on, man. It'd be great. You only get one shot at this kind of thing. Dave Grohl's offering you a beer." And I, again, turned him down. And Adam just sort of said to me, like, "What are you doing? This is our chance to hang out with the stars, But that was the kind of example of the kind of unreadiness that I think not only I, but all of us in the band had, because we are not the kind of band who've been through the Brit School or some sort of performer coaching thing and know how to be cool. We're really deeply uncool. I think the way that night panned out was we got to shake Jay-Z's hand and enjoy living the big time for a while, playing hacky sack with Norah Jones in the corridor. But it was the culmination of, as you say, a very rapidly paced couple of years. In 2008 to 9, that's when we got a manager for the first time. We started getting really professional artwork done for the first time, and that was done by a friend called Matt Halliday, and he still does really interesting artwork to this day in Oxford. We were printing things on vinyl and doing pin badges and really saving up to try and see if we could go full time with the project. But in the first 3.5 years, from 05 to 08, it had been just a project entirely for fun. I don't think we had huge ambitions for it, and we'd been gigging in pubs and handing CDs out to whoever would take them just to have a listen. And we'd had a MySpace page, but the journey up towards Jools Holland and then getting signed 5 months later on the 4AD label, that particularly intense time was when I suddenly became aware that we had something to offer and that we could take music seriously. Indeed, after we then got signed in the April of 2010, that was the start of a 7-year period of being full time with it. But that's, I think, the phase that I then refer to as a startup company, because you're in this sort of liminal phase where you're aware that you need to start delivering serious material, a new album at some point, new ideas, interesting hooks, but there's very little formal coaching for that kind of thing. There's no textbook for it.
So when it comes to recording Beachcomber's Windowsill, did you guys feel a pressure, or did you feel quite free going into the studio? I know you guys handled production all in-house, which feels quite a unique choice for a band just starting out. Often, bands will be paired with a producer by a record label, and that producer will guide them through the recording process. Where did that decision come to do everything all in-house, and what do you think that lent the quality of the songs on the record?
I think that's fundamental to how we four have enjoyed making music over the years. Even if I include Rob in there, because though we're a 3-piece these days, we're in touch with him and how he makes his music. He self-produces, and he loves to take a studio and just occupy it for a whole day to really get in the zone. This is the same way that he and I probably learned from Brian and John in how they had originally preferred to do things. Setting aside multiple hours to just sit there with the hardware and do many takes if necessary, whatever's needed to get the notes as perfect as they can be, but not resort to autotune. There's a song from Beachcomber's Windowsill, which I think best captures this, probably Saw You Blink. So it was the song that we had recorded earliest out of all the material on Beachcomber's Windowsill. That's probably the first song. Maybe Boats and Trains would have been about the same time. It's the winter of 05 into 06 when we're tracking this in bedrooms. And I think we may have rented the East Oxford Community Hall as a space to capture the drum sound. But being given our own time to do that, even if it takes an entire day to get everything right. The reason you can't use a producer or an engineer there is you've got to pay them by the by the day or the hour. So it just adds a lot of pressure, and sometimes you don't know what you're going to get. But saying that, with Saw You Blink and Boats and Trains, we then did have an incredible producer come in for the finishing touches. Brian, I think, retracked his guitars and vocal, and I retracked all the bass with Craig Silvey, who had worked with Mariah Carey and a couple of other really exciting acts. I think The Horrors had been his most recent work. This was early 2010 when we were retracking with him. But that was an experience that showed us some of the other extreme of how you can operate in terms of production, where you've got a studio and a producer and an engineer bringing in the cups of tea when they're not having to fix up the guitars and get the wiring right. It's a very pressured atmosphere. There's something exhilarating and propelling about that atmosphere, but we are very much more used to inhabiting the other end of the spectrum of approaches, where we can just do it on our own terms and no one's depending on us. I think as a band, we've always sort of morally felt that we don't want anyone depending on us to deliver something, either by a deadline or of a certain amount of quality. We always want to make whatever sounds good to us when we want to make it. That's perhaps something that doesn't suit the commercial side of the music industry, and it's why at times we've been unsigned and had to operate without support of any funding or companies. We've done our own Kickstarter, for instance, in order to raise the money to do things on our own terms. And even to this day, if I'm reflecting on the kind of demoing and new writing that we're starting to do here in 2025, any discussion of renting a space or involving someone else helping us in real time is quite a slow discussion that basically takes us back to, no, we want to do it on our own terms. We like to have our own control over the situation. It's not just creative control, it's process control. I think even the idea of a producer sitting there and sort of choosing the settings of the faders for when we hear the playback. We've had an experience where a producer gave us a very awkward playback where we could hear a lot of quantization and auto-tune put onto the takes that we'd done in the morning. We came back in the afternoon and then sort of polished it up way too much for our liking. And so we've seen a lot of the different approaches and where they might lead, and we've always reverted back to our very rootsy bedroom themed way of doing things. I think you can hear it most obviously on Beachcomber's Windowsill, but also Tales from Terra Firma. Those are the two that we made without any help. Dig the Mountain, much later, we made it with maybe a lot more experience. So I think it sounds like a better engineered album, even though it still is us operating on our own terms and our own deadlines. And I think that is, we've now settled on how we're going to keep making albums going forward.
I see. Very interesting. And it's very interesting to hear you talk about kind of engineers once you guys are out of the studio, kind of tweaking your vocals and putting auto-tunes. For a band like Stornoway, that just feels very much surplus to requirement, because your vocal sounds and the harmonies you guys have on that record, they just feel so, I don't know, they feel so wholesome, some of the vocal harmonies you guys bring to songs like I Saw You Blink. Those harmonies you guys are doing on tracks like that, did you have a choral background, any of you, or when did you decide that harmonies was going to be a big part of the sound of the band? Because I'm thinking also, when I think about songs like Josephine as well, when I see you guys play, the four of you back then, singing together, was that something that was inherent when the band started, or did you all start to become better vocalists as you went along in your career?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a question that I kind of wish we'd get asked more about, but it's got a very complicated answer. So Brian is got Irish heritage. Both his parents are Irish, and so he has this lilting, kind of soaring voice, and can sing a very, very decent Irish melody. But he grew up in Bristol as a chorister in Bristol Cathedral. And so he was then trained with his naturally excellent voice and clear tone. He was trained in how that could be arranged against other voices in harmony, and how to project and how to get sibilants and frigatives out whilst singing maybe a syllable that's not so comfortable in a vowel sense, but getting it done at the right range and the right volume. So all these technical sides. John, Rob, and I also were in choirs in schools and things. So we had elements of that training, but not to the chorister standard that Brian brings. And so when Brian's coaching us in how he wants something to sound chorally, we're definitely, learning a lot. And so he's kind of upskilling us and saying, no, it has to be like this. It has to be like this. It'll sound better if we approach it in stereo or mix it differently, or if that note comes to the top. But then what Rob and I brought from our own backgrounds into that mix was this South African choral tradition. There's world famous groups like Ladysmith, Black Mambazo, and all the choirs that you hear on the Lion King soundtrack, for instance, were choirs from Zimbabwe, Botswana, South Africa. Those are the sounds that we heard a lot growing up. And the memories that I have of when we decided to introduce backing vocals and any sort of harmony. It wasn't at the start when we sort of discussed having a band or auditioning or anything. It was probably about late 2007. We'd been together a long time. We were playing in one of the freezing cold East Oxford garages that we always ended up having our rehearsals in. And I think it was probably Saw You Blink. And I turned to Brian and said, well, we've got this really decent groove now, and we've played the song live maybe 10 times by this point. We're gigging regularly. But on the demo, there's this line in the chorus, Lucy, could you really be the one that I've been waiting for? And we're not singing that live. I'm feeling quite comfortable with the bass line. Can I maybe just have a go at singing that? And he said, oh, yeah, definitely. We should try and reenact what we're demoing live. And I don't care who sings it, really. Let's just give it a go. And we jammed that a few times. And I think that evening was the time it suddenly opened up like the vista dramatically, because we thought we're not just a indie folk rock kind of band with a single vocalist. We've got a choral element here and a choral toolbox that we can employ. But the other significant memory of us learning how to sing together was recording We Are the Battery Human. That was in a bedroom, one of the bandmates' bedrooms. We had the gear, all the recording hardware out and the microphones, and then we decided to try sing it, all four of us in one take. And by this stage, all four in the band were singing, not just me and Brian. But it was really proving quite difficult because that song has a lot of syllables that are not obvious how to sing. It depends what accent you pick. And that song, especially in that sort of hoedown infused indie folk scene at the time, with a lot of Mumford & Sons sort of faux American sound, we found we were veering into an American accent for some of the words, but Brian kept dragging us back and saying, "No, you got to sing, going. Where are you going this fine morning? It has to be going, not go in." There were just little details like that. Don't drop the T's and don't drop the G's. But the thing was, we were all singing into a microphone that had a pop shield on it, a very primitive pop shield. That would comprised a pair of pants stretched over a coat hanger. That's how impoverished and desperate we were as a band. We hadn't even bothered to buy ourselves a £5 pop shield. So what you're listening to when you hear that song on that album is we're singing through a pair of pants and and getting very confused and watching each other. Is he going to drop the G this time? Wow. So yeah, it's all been really kind of self-taught and amateur, even though individually we are drawing on some training that we received at school age. It's been quite an adventure to get to know each other vocally.
That's brilliant. It's so interesting when I get to talk to artists and or just reading and hear these kind of behind the scenes recording stories that are always so interesting and kind of unlock even more depth to the songs that kind of fans love on records. So, and hearing you kind of sing through a pair of pants, it doesn't lessen the impact of that song, Oli. I can say that for sure. One of the things you talked about just now is recording kind of vocal parts and instrument tracks within different venues within Oxford. And Oxford is obviously you feel it on the record, you hear it on the record. I think Brian mentions Cowley at least a number of times, and I've visited Oxford a number of times, and every time I've been, I always, see Cowley on a map, and I think of Stornoway singing about Cowley. And you've obviously had advocates from Oxford from such an early time, including a BBC DJ who locked himself, barricaded himself inside the studio and played your music in his studio for an hour before he got stopped. What does Oxford mean to you as a band? It must hold such a special place for you all.
Absolutely. It'll always be home musically. It'll be the place where we cut our teeth and learn the hard way, because you find yourselves on these lineups of disparate genres put together by promoters who are maybe putting on gigs when it's their first time putting on a gig and they've never done it before. But Oxford's very forgiving. It's a city of such prolific musicality that there's 6 or 7 concerts every single night of the year, and that'll be everything from classical through like reggae and jazz through to the loudest of metal and punk that you can hear. There's a plethora of venues and so many different promoters and people doing great things, and inevitably for a young band starting out, there's that phrase melting pot. You just throw yourself into the melting pot, and what Oxford gig or venue or promoter will have you, and you end up sort of finding your feet by playing to rooms of no one or 3 people, or maybe it's a real sellout because you get lucky, and then your EP, your demo disc falls into the hands of the right person to get you the next big gig. I think it's a city that punches above its weight in a huge way. It's a city of about 100,000 people to 200,000 at the most. That's during term time when the students of the 2 universities are in town. And they're all crammed into these streets that are 1,000 years old that you can't actually fit a tour bus down. So but yet, despite that relatively small population and all the logistical pressures that make it hard to actually get amplified music into the venues, it's got the legacy of bands like Radiohead, Supergrass, Foals, Ride, Glass Animals, and we're really lucky to count ourselves amongst that crowd. And every time I go back, the biggest question is, which of the 6 or 7 gigs am I going to pick for tonight's entertainment? Because I'm only in town for one night and I wish I could see them all. The other weird thing about Oxford is it keeps fighting back. In the late 90s, there was a venue closure. Multiple venues closed at the same time, and everyone thought the scene was going to be on its last legs and never recover. But through the noughties, venues were founded or reconfigured or improved to such an extent that by our kind of formation in 2005 to 10, there were just too many venues to pick from. We liked to pride ourselves on saying we've gigged every venue that Oxford has to offer, but then every week there seemed to be a new place with a new gig to play. In the mid 2010s, it faced another battle because you lost venues like the Cellar and the Wheatsheaf, which were right in the heart of town, and they had been very important. The Gloucester Arms also changed ownership and no longer has music. But everyone I talked to this year in 2025, they're saying it's fighting back now. There's campaigns to establish new venues. There are already some grassroots venues, not just on the outskirts, but in the center of town. So it's fighting back. And I think it'll always have that cyclicality, Oxford. Every 15, 20 years, there'll be a property developer trying to shut things down and change or dilute the culture of the city, but it keeps coming back. So I can't wait to see what Oxford has to offer, in the decades to come. So much more new, exciting music. But one final thing there is they have their BBC introducing show for Oxfordshire and Berkshire, which is the combined platform where they discover new bands. Tim Bearder, who you mentioned, sort of spearheaded that. He created that show called the BBC Oxford Download, and it was all about discovering new music. Eventually, that became part of the wider BBC introducing initiative for the whole country. But the fact that he was at the forefront there was so important. He really led the way in showing how a city that had an indie rock heritage and had put so many bands through to being signed artists could keep doing it if you gave them a weekly platform where people could submit demos and do interviews and performances. So I think it's largely thanks to that individual, Tim Bearder, and the team that he created around him, that Oxford continues to fight back.
That's great. And it's so interesting to hear you talk about the importance of kind of grassroots and DIY and kind of fledgling venues in kind of giving, bands like an early Stornoway or bands at the start of their career that kind of lift up to kind of get the visibility that propels them onto bigger things. And obviously we're at a time when a lot of venues across the country are closing down, and that's a very sad thing. So I think it's, you know, it's great to hear you talk about the importance of those venues for the band's career. So you talk about, you know, the specificity of place within the album. Oxford is such an important part of the band's story, but also there is this kind of great universality of the great outdoors and nature as well, which is so synonymous with the band's story. And, you know, I think of one of my favorite lyrics from the record, which is from, you know, the Cold Harbour Road. I am a seabird, you are the Arctic Ocean. And it conjures up such a kind of, such a poetic way to conjure up such a very naturalistic image. But the album is peppered with that kind of imagery all the way through, throughout the runtime, Ollie. So talking about the band's relationship with nature and the great outdoors, how did that find its way into the songwriting? Was that a conscious thing that, I guess, Brian peppered into the lyrics whilst he came up with the songs, or was that something that all four of you had a hand in making sure that the importance of the outdoors came through in the lyrics?
Brian, since school days, had been obsessed with nature and terrified by climate change. So conservation has been something that for him has fused morally his worldviews, and then bringing that into music making and singing about it explicitly has been almost like a raison d'etre for Brian. It's probably one of the things that most significantly influenced his songwriting, apart from relationships and romantic love, which you hear obviously in the lyrics explicitly, but nature's always there, hinted at in the aesthetics of the songs. For the rest of us, nature's always been very important, and in South Africa, most of our time outdoors was spent at conservation reserves, or looking at how biodiversity was being maintained, or erosion was trying to be countered in places in South Africa where construction projects had gone wrong and created a lot of erosion. We went and took part in projects that were about remedying that. But we didn't set out at the start to be a kind of eco-folk band, or think of ourselves as particularly sustainability conscious. It just sort of weaved its way in through who ended up listening to us, and the kinds of wild outdoor spaces that invited us to come and play. The first time we really consciously made an effort to associate with conservation trusts was when we got the Marine Conservation Society to accept a share of the profits from us, from our third EP. That was called, I think it was just called the Stornoway EP, but it had the Good Fish Guide on it. And every sale of the Good Fish Guide single, we sent a decent portion of the profits to the MCS. The next time we did it was the Sumatran Orangutan Society. We raised £11,000 for them in a concert for conservation, I think it 2011. We've always been into hiking as a band, and most of our music videos are filmed outdoors in some sort of wild location. But it's a great question, because it makes me reflect on whether that was ever in our charter when we began, or whether it's just naturally found its way into our hearts. And I think it very much is the latter.
Very interesting, and it leads me on to the song we kind of mentioned at the kind of top of the conversation, We Are the Battery Human, which is a kind of ode to the great outdoors, if you like, Ollie, and a kind of trademark song for the band. Could you talk a little bit about the importance of that song and why it strikes a chord for you?
Yeah, Battery Human. For me, it's a fairly clear these days that is the song that strings a thread through everything we've ever done, because it's explicitly about mental health and how nature and music making and mental health are all part of the same sort of elixir that humans need to be able to take on a daily basis. If we don't get outside and stare at the sun and get our hearts racing for some reason or other, then we're self-administering poison. You can have too much technology, and I've referred to technology as a great enabler many times earlier in our conversation, but there's too much of a good thing. And these days I try to hold the battery human message up as the sort of lens through which I see everything we do. Are we going to play a certain concert or tour or release a certain song or album? Well, if we're going to do it, does it echo that phrase, we are the battery human, or free the battery human? That's really the mission statement of the band. Free the battery human, because no one wants to be trapped in a world of mental anxiety and depression for the reason that they haven't been able to get outside. It's such a simple antidote, and I'm really proud that 15, 20 years ago we committed that message to record and put it out there, and then we continue to play it on our gigs these days.
Does it feel odd to think about the message, the sentiment of that song now? I mean, 20 years ago, you were playing it, or 15 years ago or so, and now it just feels even more salient for the times we live in. Does it feel strange to reflect where tech is now on that song?
Yeah, I think it's only become more obvious and apparent and demonstrable that certain kinds of technology are basically poison. I am guilty as anyone else of requiring my phone as an essential device to help me manage my life, and yet I'm really interested in and developing ways of minimizing the dependency on the phone. I think it's one of the great challenges of our time, is how to remind ourselves daily that we're being sold products in the form of these phones and apps and addictive pieces of software that are good for us up to an extent, but really, really terribly dangerous for us beyond that extent. And with an 18-month-old daughter, I'm particularly conscious that I'm going to try and keep her protected from technology for as long as I can before it takes the kind of hold on her that it has on me. I think for me it was it was late enough in my development that I'd managed to get a lot of outdoors time as a kid. But then the way that technology has colored my music making, my ability to study and share experiences with friends, it's very, very dramatic. And I know a lot of people around me who've been absolutely changed by the ways that they have become addicted to technology. So without being too doom and gloom or conspiracist or dystopian about it, I think we live in a time of great opportunity for people to figure out what it is that technology is meant to do for us, and how much of a sacrifice it's worth making for the conveniences it brings.
And that's a very good excuse to listen again to a song like We Are the Battery Human and be reminded, like you say, of why it's important to put the phones down or the computer away and get out and enjoy what the natural world has to offer. I just want to ask you, just going back to the songwriting, Ollie, and this is something I like to ask artists when I speak to them. Obviously, an album like Beachcomber's Windowsill has these big songs like Zorbing and I Saw You Blink and or We Are the Battery Human, songs that have become kind of signature songs for the band. Are there any tracks or even parts of tracks on the record that you are particularly proud of, that you feel you'd like to champion more and wish there was more attention paid to those lesser known elements of the album?
On Beachcomber's Windowsill, my two highlight moments that I treasure in my memory, but I don't think that we get enough opportunities to hear how other people treasure them, or we certainly don't get any opportunity to play them live, are a Long Distance Lullaby, which when it came along in the very final weeks before we decided to commit the album to record, it was the last song written, and it was one that just sort of flew in to the band's repertoire within a matter of days. Brian had sent this demo, which had these extremely neat but poetic lines about the soulmate and getting too drunk and then making that call that no one wants to make, and it's such a perfect song. And then we recorded it in such a way that, and I think it's one of the last tracks on the album, that it's almost done in a sort of throwaway fashion. And so we never get requested to sing that one, and I very rarely hear people reflect on it. The second one is On the Rocks. That's probably for me the most special of the Stornoway songs, and it'll always remind me of the winters and the waters around Oxfordshire. It would flood all the time. It was a time and a place that whose ethereal qualities were captured in that song, and yet it goes so loud. It becomes this loud anthem of a sort of a wig out of a song, and it's a thrill to be able to almost scream the backing vocal when we perform it live. Well, we've not done it for about 10 years now. There's a recording I'm really proud of, which is our live at the Sheldonian Theatre. I think the first time we played it, where we do On the Rocks, and I'm just about managing to get into the right range to harmonise with Brian. So sorry, long answer, but those are my two moments from Beachcomber's Windowsill that I wish would get more airtime.
Before we finish, I'd just like to ask you, what does the future hold for Stornoway? Do you have any immediate plans, and what's coming up that fans can look forward to?
Well, it's great that you asked that, because today, Wednesday 19th, I can reveal that Stornoway are going to be playing at the Royal Albert Hall in London next March. On the 30th of March to 2026, we're finally going to get to play this iconic venue, and we've placed it more than a year in advance, because that's how long it's going to take us to figure out the role that we want the music to play versus the role that we want nature to play in the concert. It's going to be all about different soundscapes, bringing our songs from the mountains and the seasides and the forests all into a single set, with potentially a bit of choir and orchestral stuff going on, so that we can give people for the first time all these different habitats reimagined musically in the way that we've always wanted. So it's taken us this long to find a venue that's capable of delivering that awesome sonic experience, and the Albert Hall it is. Apart from that, we're going to be playing a couple of festivals this summer, but 2025 is going to be a quiet year whilst we prepare for that huge show next spring.
That's fantastic. That is so exciting to hear, Oli, and going to the Royal Albert Hall as a fan and a patron. It's such a wonderful venue, and it will really bring even further to life Stornoway's music, I think. So that's very exciting. Fans can look forward to that. That's brilliant. And thanks for taking the time, Oli. And in the meantime, fans can listen to all of the great Stornoway records, including that fantastic debut album, which we've reflected on.